The simple act of kindness. Chris pedaled his bike down the quiet suburban streets, the autumn sun casting long shadows across the neighborhood. He loved these rides, feeling the wind against his face and the freedom of the open street. Today, as he rounded the corner onto Sycamore Drive, something unusual caught his eye. There, on the porch of a small house with a neatly kept yard, stood Mrs. Garcia. The elderly woman was hunched over an old television set, her brow furrowed in frustration. Chris slowed his bike to a halt, his curiosity piqued. Mrs. Garcia was one of the friendliest people in the neighborhood. She had a warm smile for everyone and was known for sharing her homemade cookies with kids passing by. But lately, Chris had noticed her around less, and when he did see her, she seemed distant, her usual vibrant energy subdued. Now, seeing her struggling with that heavy TV, his heart filled with concern. "Hey, Mrs. Garcia," he called, hopping off his bike and walking toward her. "Need some help?" Mrs. Garcia looked up, surprise flickering across her face before she broke into a smile. "Oh, Chris, bless you. This old thing has finally given up on me, I think." She gestured to the TV, her hands trembling slightly. "I was hoping to catch my favorite show, but it just won't work." Chris's heart went out to her. He knew how much she loved her programs. She and his mom would sometimes chat about the latest episode of her favorite crime drama. Without hesitation, Chris set his bike against the porch railing and knelt beside the TV. "I can take a look if you want. I'm pretty good with this kind of stuff," he offered. Mrs. Garcia's face lit up. "You'd do that? Oh, Chris, that's very kind of you." Chris got to work, carefully inspecting the TV's old wiring. He knew these models were temperamental and figured it might just need a loose wire reconnected. Mrs. Garcia hovered nearby, her fingers intertwined in silent hope. After a few moments of tinkering, Chris found the issue: a loose connection. With a steady hand, he reattached the wire, and the screen crackled to life, displaying a clear picture. Mrs. Garcia gasped, clasping her hands in delight. "You did it, Chris. You really did it." Chris beamed, feeling a swell of pride. "It was an easy fix, really," he said modestly, "but I'm glad I could help." Tears glistened in Mrs. Garcia's eyes as she placed a hand on his shoulder. "Thank you, Chris. You have no idea how much this means to me. This TV was a gift from my late husband. He loved it. I thought I'd lost another piece of him." Chris felt a lump form in his throat. He hadn't realized how much this simple television meant to her. Fixing it had suddenly become more than a small act of kindness. It was a way of restoring a cherished memory for her. "I'm really glad it's working again, Mrs. Garcia," he said softly. Mrs. Garcia smiled warmly and extended an invitation. "Come inside, dear. I just baked some cookies, and it's the least I can do to thank you." Chris's face lit up. He hadn't expected this, but cookies from Mrs. Garcia were legendary in the neighborhood. "That sounds great. Thank you." As they sat in her cozy living room, Chris munched on the fresh cookies, savoring their soft texture and sweet taste. Mrs. Garcia shared stories from her life, reminiscing about her late husband, who had been a police officer. She spoke of his bravery and kindness, her eyes misting over with each memory. Listening to her, Chris realized how much she missed him, how alone she must have felt. "You know," he said gently, "if you ever need any help with things around the house, I'd be happy to help. I don't live far, and my schedule's pretty flexible after school." Mrs. Garcia's eyes softened as she reached across the table, placing a gentle hand on his. "Thank you, Chris. You're a very special young man. Your parents should be proud of you." Chris felt a warm glow inside, knowing he brought some light into her day. As he pedaled back home that evening, he couldn't help but think about Mrs. Garcia, her stories, and the depth of her kindness. It felt like he had gained something valuable, and he was eager to tell his parents about his new friend and their heartwarming encounter. An unexpected knock. The next morning, Chris woke up with a smile. As he made his way to the kitchen, He could still taste the sweetness of Mrs. Garcia's cookies from the day before. His parents were already seated at the breakfast table, sipping coffee and exchanging glances, clearly curious about their son's glowing mood. "Morning, Chris," his dad said, raising an eyebrow. "Looks like you had a good day yesterday." Chris grinned, grabbing a piece of toast. "Yeah, I did. I helped Mrs. Garcia fix her old TV, and she invited me in for cookies. She told me all these amazing stories about her husband. He was a police officer, you know." His mom nodded, a soft smile on her face. "Mrs. Garcia's been through a lot, Chris. It's wonderful that you're reaching out to her. I think she's been a little lonely since her husband passed." Chris thought back to the look in Mrs. Garcia's eyes when she talked about her husband. He couldn't imagine how hard it must be to lose someone who had been part of her life for so long. "Yeah," he said thoughtfully. "I think she really appreciated the help." After breakfast, Chris spent the rest of his Saturday finishing up homework, his mind still drifting to Mrs. Garcia's stories and her inviting warmth. He decided that he'd make it a point to check in on her regularly. She'd invited him back, and he didn't want her to feel like she was alone. The next morning was calm and quiet. Chris was still lingering in bed, his mind drowsy, when he heard a knock at the front door. It was firm and steady, not the casual knock of a neighbor stopping by. Curiosity pulled him out of bed, and he shuffled to the hallway just as his dad opened the door. Standing there, looking serious but gentle, was a police officer. Next to him was Mrs. Garcia, clutching a small worn handbag with both hands, her expression tense yet hopeful. Chris's heart skipped a beat. Why was she here with the police? "Good morning," the officer greeted, nodding at Mr. Johnson. "Are you Mr. Johnson?" "I'm Officer Daniels. We came to speak to your son, Chris, if that's all right." Mr. Johnson's face tightened with concern, glancing back at Chris. "Of course. Is everything okay?" Mrs. Garcia stepped forward, offering a soft smile in Chris' direction. "Chris, I'm so sorry to bring the officer here like this," she said, her voice warm but slightly shaky. "But I have a little request. You see, there's something very important to me that I'd like you to know about." Chris exchanged a puzzled glance with his parents before nodding. "Sure, Mrs. Garcia. What's going on?" The officer stepped inside, nodding politely at Mrs. Johnson, who led them all to the living room. Chris sat down on the edge of the couch, his eyes darting between Mrs. Garcia and Officer Daniels, trying to piece together what could be so important. Mrs. Garcia began, her voice calm and filled with sincerity. "Chris, when you fixed my television, I didn't just see it as an act of kindness. I felt it in my heart as a reminder of someone I once knew." She paused, glancing down at her wrinkled hands before meeting his gaze. "You remind me of my son, who passed away when he was only 18. He was full of kindness, just like you, and he always went out of his way to help others." Chris's breath caught in his throat. He had no idea. He glanced at his parents, who were both watching Mrs. Garcia with empathy. Her story had touched them, as much as it did him. Officer Daniels cleared his throat, picking up where Mrs. Garcia left off. "Chris, Mrs. Garcia came to us yesterday and asked if there was any way we could help her reach out to you. She told us that fixing her TV was a lot more than just a kind gesture to her. She feels a special connection to you." Chris felt a warmth spread in his chest, though he couldn't quite understand it. He looked up at Mrs. Garcia, who continued, "I lost my son, Tommy, a long time ago. And in many ways, it's left a gap in my life. Seeing you reminded me of the love I felt for him, the happiness he brought to my days. I guess what I'm trying to say is, I'd like to spend more time with you, if you'd be willing. Maybe you could help me with a few things around the house, and I could teach you a few things too. And perhaps, just maybe, I could share with you some of Tommy's old belongings, things he would have liked you to have." Chris swallowed hard, touched by her words. He looked at his parents, who nodded encouragingly, giving him the green light. "That would be amazing, Mrs. Garcia," he said, smiling. "I'd love to help out. I feel really lucky to have met you." Her face lit up, the lines around her eyes softening as she beamed. "Thank you, Chris. You've already brought so much joy back into my life. I can't wait for us to spend more time together." A bond begins. From that day on, Chris and Mrs. Garcia began a new routine. Every few afternoons after school, Chris would hop on his bike and pedal over to her house. She'd greet him at the door, always with a smile and a snack ready, and they'd spend the afternoon chatting, working, or sharing stories. One day, as they sat in her cozy living room, Mrs. Garcia handed Chris a small box. "These belong to Tommy," she said softly. "I've been holding on to them for years, hoping to find someone who could appreciate them. I think you're that person, Chris." Inside the box were small trinkets, things that seemed simple yet carried meaning. A pocket knife, worn and dull, that Tommy had once used to carve his initials into the backyard tree. A baseball cap, faded from the sun. And a journal with a few entries that captured the thoughts of a young man full of dreams and plans for the future. "Wow, Mrs. Garcia, this is amazing," Chris said, his voice full of wonder. "Thank you for sharing this with me." As Chris carefully went through each item, Mrs. Garcia shared stories of Tommy, how he'd loved helping people, how he planned to follow in his father's footsteps and join the police force, how he'd always been the first to volunteer when anyone in the community needed assistance. Listening to her, Chris felt as if he were meeting Tommy himself, gaining a new understanding of the boy whose memory he was helping to keep alive. One evening, as Chris was about to leave, Mrs. Garcia took his hand. "Chris, you've changed my life more than you'll ever know. I feel like I have a reason to smile again." Chris smiled back at her, his heart swelling with gratitude. "You've changed my life too, Mrs. Garcia. Thank you for letting me be part of yours." A ripple of kindness. Word began to spread around the neighborhood about Chris's visits to Mrs. Garcia. People started noticing the joy that had returned to her face, the spring in her step as she walked down the street. Other neighbors, inspired by Chris's kindness, began reaching out to Mrs. Garcia as well, offering her help or simply stopping by to chat. In time, Chris's simple act of fixing her television had set off a chain of kindness throughout the community. One day, Mrs. Garcia hosted a small gathering in her backyard, inviting Chris and his family along with a few neighbors who had become part of her life. As the sun set over the neighborhood, casting a warm glow over the gathering, Mrs. Garcia stood up and raised a glass of lemonade. "To Chris," she said, her voice filled with warmth, "for reminding us all that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can have the biggest impact." Everyone raised their glasses in toast, and Chris felt a glow of pride and happiness that he would remember forever. As their friendship deepened, Chris and Mrs. Garcia learned from each other, grew together, and found a family they never knew they needed. It was just the beginning of a connection that would last a lifetime, one built on the simple foundation of kindness, compassion, and the power of a helping hand. The promise of friendship. The months passed, and Chris's visits to Mrs. Garcia's house became a regular part of his life. Every few days after school, he'd grab his bike and ride over, filled with anticipation. Each visit brought new stories and a growing sense of purpose he'd never felt before. Mrs. Garcia had begun to share her own life's wisdom with him, often over a glass of lemonade and a plate of freshly baked cookies. She taught him simple things, like how to grow tomatoes in small garden pots, and more profound lessons about life, love, and resilience. One day, Chris noticed Mrs. Garcia sitting on her porch, gazing at the sky with a thoughtful expression. She had that old, familiar box resting in her lap. He approached quietly, sensing something important in her eyes. "Hi, Mrs. Garcia," he greeted, taking a seat on the step beside her. "What's on your mind?" She smiled gently and patted his hand. "I was just thinking about how life changes when you least expect it. This old neighborhood used to be so lively. Kids playing, families visiting each other, neighbors talking over fences. Now it's so quiet." Her gaze softened. "But you've brought that life back, Chris. You've brought back a warmth I thought I'd lost. Chris blushed, humbled by her words. I just like spending time with you, Mrs. Garcia. You make everything feel important. She nodded, her eyes twinkling with warmth. That's the magic of human connection, my dear. We give each other purpose, make life brighter just by being together. And sometimes, just when you think life is settled, it surprises you. With that, she opened the box and pulled out a small notebook, its edges worn from years of handling. This was Tommy's journal, she said, handing it to Chris. He wrote in it every day. Hopes, dreams, little ideas. I've kept it all these years, but I want you to read it. Chris's eyes widened. Are you sure? I mean, this feels so personal. She nodded, her voice soft. I think he would have wanted you to see it. Maybe it will give you some inspiration, like it once did for him. Chris carefully accepted the notebook, turning it over in his hands, feeling the weight of its pages. Thank you, Mrs. Garcia. I promise I'll take good care of it. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun dipped lower in the sky, bathing the street in hues of orange and pink. As Chris held the notebook, he felt a deeper sense of connection, not only to Tommy but to Mrs. Garcia's own history, her struggles, and her resilience. A new perspective. That evening, after finishing his homework, Chris sat on his bed and opened Tommy's notebook. The pages were filled with a young man's dreams, notes about travel, aspirations to become a police officer like his father, and little sketches of adventures he wanted to go on. Chris was captivated by Tommy's thoughts, each one sparking a sense of wonder and familiarity. Tommy had written so honestly, and Chris felt as if he were hearing from a friend. One particular entry caught his eye. It read, I want to make a difference. Maybe it'll be in some big way, like becoming a detective, or maybe it'll just be helping out a neighbor. But I want to leave things better than I found them. Chris closed the notebook, his heart full. It was as if Tommy's words had come to life, guiding him towards something he hadn't fully understood before. He felt an overwhelming urge to do something meaningful, just as Tommy had envisioned. The next day, Chris approached Mrs. Garcia with a determined look. I want to make a difference too, he told her, his voice full of conviction. Tommy's words, they really got to me. Mrs. Garcia's face softened. Oh, Chris, he would be so proud of you. You already make a difference. Just being here, listening and helping, you're changing lives more than you know. Chris nodded, his thoughts racing. But maybe there's more I can do. Something that could bring people together, just like you said. Something that could make the neighborhood feel like it used to. Mrs. Garcia's eyes brightened. Well, you know, we used to have these neighborhood gatherings every month. We'd set up tables, share food, and tell stories. People would laugh, kids would play. It was wonderful. Chris's face lit up with inspiration. Why don't we bring that back? We could organize a neighborhood get-together. We could make it something special for everyone. Mrs. Garcia clapped her hands in delight. Oh, Chris, that would be lovely. I think it would do everyone a world of good to feel connected again. Organizing the gathering. Over the next few days, Chris threw himself into planning the neighborhood gathering. With Mrs. Garcia by his side, he went door to door, inviting everyone, young and old, to join. Some people were surprised by the idea, others hesitant, but Chris's enthusiasm was contagious. He painted a picture of a lively, vibrant neighborhood, where everyone felt welcome and cared for, and soon, even the most reserved neighbors were on board. Chris's parents offered to help, thrilled by the way their son was uniting the community. They provided tables, decorations, and even baked some treats for the event. Mrs. Garcia also prepared her famous chocolate chip cookies, which Chris insisted were the best in the world. The day of the gathering dawned bright and sunny, with a crisp autumn breeze in the air. Chris and his family set up tables in the neighborhood park, adorning them with decorations, while Mrs. Garcia directed the placement of food and seating arrangements. She was in her element, her eyes alight with joy and purpose. As people began to arrive, Chris watched the neighborhood come alive in a way he'd never seen. Families brought dishes to share, kids played games, and neighbors who hadn't spoken in years struck up conversations. Chris saw laughter and warmth in every direction, and he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of accomplishment. Mrs. Garcia approached him with a smile, her face glowing with pride. "Look at what you've done, Chris," she said, her voice soft with emotion. "You've brought us all back together." Chris looked around, taking in the sight of families laughing and neighbors chatting like old friends. "We did it together, Mrs. Garcia. I couldn't have done it without you." The gathering continued into the evening, and as the sun began to set, Mrs. Garcia asked everyone to raise a glass, even if it was just a plastic cup of lemonade. "I want to thank each and every one of you," she began, her voice carrying over the gentle hum of the crowd. "In life, we sometimes lose sight of what really matters. It's easy to get busy, to drift apart. But Chris here reminded me that connection is what brings meaning to our lives. He reminded me of the joy that comes from sharing moments with those around us." Everyone raised their cups, cheering for Chris, who blushed and smiled. He was just happy to see everyone together, happy to know he'd made a difference. A heartfelt gesture. As the gathering wound down, Mrs. Garcia took Chris aside and handed him something wrapped in a soft cloth. "This belonged to Tommy," she said, her eyes filled with meaning. "I think he would want you to have it." Unwrapping it carefully, Chris found a small polished badge with the initials TG engraved on it. It was Tommy's name tag from when he had begun training to join the police academy. Chris's eyes widened, touched by the gesture. I don't know what to say," he stammered. "Thank you, Mrs. Garcia. This means a lot." Mrs. Garcia smiled, a gentle, knowing smile. "You're like family to me, Chris. You remind me of all the good in this world. Keep that badge close, and remember that you have the power to bring people together, to make the world a better place." Chris nodded, holding the badge in his hand. The small object seemed to carry a weight of responsibility, but he felt ready to embrace it. It was as if Tommy's spirit was there with him, guiding him forward. As he rode home that night, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had done something good, something lasting, and he knew that it was just the beginning of a journey of kindness and purpose. A test of resilience. The success of the neighborhood gathering lingered in the air like the warmth of an autumn bonfire. Chris noticed a new sense of unity in the community. Neighbors who once exchanged only nods now shared waves and friendly conversations. Even the normally quiet park down the road seemed livelier, with kids playing together and families spending more time outside. But as the seasons shifted from crisp autumn to the chill of early winter, Mrs. Garcia's health began to change. Chris noticed it one afternoon during one of their regular visits. She greeted him with her usual warm smile, but her hands trembled slightly, and a cough that wouldn't quit punctuated her laughter. "Mrs. Garcia, are you feeling all right?" Chris asked gently, his brow furrowed with concern. "Oh, I'm just fine, dear," she replied, brushing off his worry with a smile. "Just a little under the weather, I suppose. It's that time of year after all." But Chris wasn't convinced. He'd grown close enough to Mrs. Garcia to sense when something was wrong. Her cough worsened over the next few visits, and she seemed to tire more easily, spending more time sitting in her armchair, a blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Chris couldn't bear to see her like this. He spoke to his parents about his concerns one evening after dinner. "I think Mrs. Garcia might need some extra help. She's not been feeling well, and I think it's more than just a cold." His mom and dad exchanged a glance, nodding in agreement. "You're right, Chris," his mom said. "We've noticed she seems a bit more tired lately. We could offer to help her with some errands, maybe bring her some groceries." Mr. Johnson placed a hand on Chris's shoulder. "And if she needs medical attention, we'll help her arrange it. We're all part of her support system now." Hearing his parents' reassurance lifted some of the weight off Chris's heart. Knowing they were there for Mrs. Garcia too made him feel stronger in facing whatever lay ahead. A quiet resolve. Determined to support Mrs. Garcia, Chris started spending more time with her, running small errands and helping around the house as much as he could. He'd stop by after school to tidy up, carry in firewood for her fireplace, or pick up groceries. Mrs. Garcia tried to brush off the help at first, but soon she began to relax, allowing him to lighten her load. One chilly afternoon, as Chris folded a pile of blankets in the living room, Mrs. Garcia watched him with a tender expression. "You remind me more and more of Tommy," she said, her voice soft with nostalgia. "He was always fussing over me, making sure I was comfortable. He used to tell me that looking after each other was the most important thing in life." Chris paused, feeling the familiar tug at his heart that came with mentions of Tommy. "I'm glad I can be here for you, Mrs. Garcia," he said quietly. "I don't have a brother or sister, but, in a way, I feel like Tommy's become a part of my family too." Mrs. Garcia's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. She reached out, giving his hand a gentle squeeze. "Thank you, Chris. That means the world to me." The crisis. One bitterly cold evening, Chris received a call from his mother while he was at a friend's house. "Chris," she said, her voice edged with worry, "I need you to come home." Mrs. Garcia was taken to the hospital. Chris's heart pounded in his chest as he grabbed his coat and rushed home, his mind swirling with questions. When he arrived, his parents were already preparing to head to the hospital. Without a second thought, Chris insisted on going with them. At the hospital, Chris spotted Mrs. Garcia in a small room, hooked up to machines with a gentle hum filling the space. She looked frail and small against the stark white sheets, her usual warmth diminished in the sterile setting. But her eyes softened as they landed on him. "Chris," she whispered, managing a weak smile. "My dear boy." Chris approached her, taking her hand in his, trying to keep his own hands from trembling. "I'm here, Mrs. Garcia," he said, his voice steady with determination. "Whatever you need, I'm here." She smiled faintly, a glimmer of her usual spirit shining through. "You've been a light in my life, Chris. I hope you know that." The doctor entered, explaining that Mrs. Garcia had a severe respiratory infection and would need to stay in the hospital for observation. Chris and his family sat with her as much as they could, their presence a source of comfort. Over the next few days, Chris came by every afternoon, bringing her flowers, books, and even a few cookies he baked himself, though they never turned out quite like hers. One day, while Chris was sitting beside her, Mrs. Garcia reached out and gently touched his cheek. "You know," she murmured, "you're the closest thing I've had to family in years." Chris felt tears prick his eyes. "You're like family to me too, Mrs. Garcia. I promise, no matter what, I'll always be here for you." She smiled, her eyes shining with gratitude. "You're a remarkable young man, Chris. I feel as though Tommy sent you to me to show me kindness and joy once more." Chris couldn't hold back the tears any longer. He squeezed her hand, feeling the truth of her words settle deeply within him. A community's strength. News of Mrs. Garcia's hospitalization spread through the neighborhood, and the impact of her absence was felt by all. Neighbors who had attended the recent gathering and those who had once taken Chris's kindness for granted began to rally together, each wanting to lend a hand. One evening, Chris heard a knock at his door and opened it to find Mrs. Singh, an elderly neighbor who lived 2 houses down. She held a small pot of soup in her hands, her face filled with concern. "Chris, I heard about Mrs. Garcia," she said, her voice gentle. "Would you take this to her? It's her favorite, the soup she used to share with my late husband. I thought it might bring her some comfort." Touched by the gesture, Chris accepted the soup and thanked Mrs. Singh. As he walked to the hospital with the pot of warm soup cradled carefully in his hands, he realized how deeply Mrs. Garcia had touched everyone's lives. Her kindness had woven invisible threads through the community, connecting neighbors in ways they hadn't realized. Upon entering Mrs. Garcia's hospital room, Chris carefully set the soup on the small table beside her bed. She blinked awake, and when she saw the familiar dish, her eyes brightened. "Mrs. Singh made it," Chris explained. "She thought it might remind you of home." Mrs. Garcia managed a small, grateful smile. That's just like her. She's been a dear friend over the years. As she sipped the soup, Chris noticed a renewed sense of peace settle over her. The simple act of receiving kindness had brought a sense of home into the sterile hospital room, and for a brief moment, it felt as though the entire neighborhood had gathered around Mrs. Garcia, enveloping her with warmth and love. The path forward. After a few weeks, Mrs. Garcia was finally able to return home, though she needed assistance. Chris was there every day, helping her settle back in, ensuring she took her medication, and making her tea just the way she liked. With each passing day, Mrs. Garcia's strength returned, her spirits lifting as Chris continued to be by her side. One evening, after they had shared dinner, Mrs. Garcia took Chris's hand and led him to the backyard. The garden was still asleep in the winter cold, but she pointed to a spot near the fence. "Chris," she said softly, "I'd like to plant something here. A tree, maybe. Something to symbolize what you've brought into my life. A reminder of the love and kindness you've shown me, and the legacy I hope to leave behind." Chris felt his throat tighten with emotion. "I think that would be perfect, Mrs. Garcia. And I promise I'll take care of it." They stood together in the cold, each lost in thought, picturing the tree that would one day grow, the living symbol of the bond they shared. It would be a place for them to remember each other, a spot of comfort and peace that would stand long after they were gone. In the weeks that followed, they planned for spring, eagerly anticipating the day they could plant the tree together. As winter began to recede, Chris found himself filled with a quiet determination. This experience with Mrs. Garcia had shown him not only the strength of community, but the profound impact a simple act of kindness could have. Planting roots. Spring arrived slowly, bringing with it warmer days and new buds on the neighborhood trees. The bleakness of winter faded, and with it, the worries that had plagued Chris. Mrs. Garcia was finally regaining her strength, her laughter more frequent, her energy returning, if a bit slower than before. True to her word, she and Chris began planning to plant the tree they had envisioned, a symbol of their friendship and the love that had grown between them. One afternoon, Chris and his father went to a local nursery to pick out a tree. They spent hours roaming among the greenery, examining each sapling carefully. Eventually, Chris's eyes landed on a young oak tree, its branches small but strong, its roots already established in the soil. "This one," Chris said, his voice filled with certainty. "An oak. It's strong, and it'll live a long time, just like Mrs. Garcia and I talked about." Mr. Johnson looked at his son, pride gleaming in his eyes. "Good choice, Chris. Oaks are resilient, just like you." They brought the sapling back to Mrs. Garcia's house, where she greeted them at the door, her eyes lighting up as she saw the young tree. She placed a hand over her heart, her gaze tender. "Oh, Chris, it's perfect. Strong, just like Tommy would have wanted." Chris and Mrs. Garcia chose a sunny spot in her backyard near the garden fence, where they began to dig together, their hands working side by side. Mrs. Garcia insisted on helping, despite Chris' protests, and with every shovelful of dirt, their laughter filled the air. "You know," Mrs. Garcia began, pausing to catch her breath, "this spot used to have a small maple tree. Tony planted it when he was about your age. It grew beautifully, right here. But when the harsh winter hit a few years ago, it didn't survive. I thought I'd never want to plant anything here again." Chris nodded, understanding the weight of her memories. "Well, I think this oak will be even stronger, and it'll have both of us looking after it." Mrs. Garcia smiled, her face softening as she rested her hand on his shoulder. "Thank you, Chris, for bringing life back into this space." Together, they carefully lowered the oak into the hole, covering its roots with soil and gently patting down the earth. When they finished, they stepped back, admiring the young tree that now stood proudly in its new home. "Every time I look out here, I'll think of you, Chris," Mrs. Garcia whispered, her voice filled with gratitude. This tree will be a reminder of what you've given me. Friendship, love, and hope. Chris nodded, feeling the same swell of emotion. He knew that the tree was more than just a symbol. It was a promise, a testament to the bond that had formed between them. And as they watered the tree, watching the sunlight filter through its leaves, Chris felt something settle within him, a sense of peace, of belonging. A community's gift. Over the following weeks, news of the tree planting spread through the neighborhood. Inspired by Chris and Mrs. Garcia, other neighbors began to get involved, each wanting to contribute in their own way. Mrs. Ng offered her famous rose cuttings to plant around the oak, hoping to add her own touch to the garden. Mr. Ramirez from down the street offered his gardening expertise, promising to help care for the young tree through its early days. One weekend, Chris organized a small gathering in Mrs. Garcia's backyard, inviting everyone in the neighborhood to see the tree. Neighbors brought flowers, small plants, and even bird feeders to hang nearby, each one adding to the garden with a personal touch. Mrs. Garcia watched with tear-filled eyes as her backyard transformed into a shared sanctuary, filled with life and love from those around her. Chris stood beside Mrs. Garcia as she spoke to the gathering, her voice filled with gratitude. "This young tree," she said, "isn't just a tree. It's a symbol of the kindness, resilience, and unity that Chris has shown us all. I never imagined my small backyard would bring us together in such a beautiful way." The crowd applauded, and Chris felt a wave of pride wash over him. His parents beamed at him from the crowd, their faces glowing with pride. He had never felt more certain of his purpose, nor more connected to those around him. As dusk fell, everyone lingered, reluctant to leave. The backyard was now adorned with hanging lights and the scent of freshly planted flowers, and Chris felt as though he were standing at the heart of something truly special, a community brought together by the simple act of kindness. A letter from the past. One afternoon, as Chris was leaving Mrs. Garcia's house, she called him back with a soft smile. "Chris, before you go, there's something I want you to have." Curious, he followed her into the house, where she handed him a yellowed envelope, its edges worn and faded. "This letter," she explained, "was written by Tommy. He wrote it the night before he left for the academy. I've never shared it with anyone, but I think he'd want you to read it." As Chris finished reading, he looked up to see Mrs. Garcia watching him, her eyes misty but filled with pride. "I think Tommy would have been very happy to know you, Chris. You're everything he hoped to be, and more." Chris was at a loss for words. He folded the letter carefully, feeling Tommy's spirit, his hope, his courage, and his love. He looked at Mrs. Garcia, understanding the depth of her loss and the gift she'd given him by sharing this piece of her son. "I'll always do my best, Mrs. Garcia, for you and for Tommy." She nodded, her hand resting on his shoulder. "I know you will, Chris. You've already shown me more than I ever imagined." An unexpected opportunity. A few weeks later, Chris received a surprising call from Mr. Williams, the head of a local youth program. Mr. Williams had heard about Chris's efforts in the neighborhood and the impact he'd made on Mrs. Garcia's life. He invited Chris to join a youth leadership program that focused on community involvement, service projects, and mentorship. "We could use someone like you, Chris," Mr. Williams said. "You've already shown remarkable empathy and leadership. This program could be the next step for you." Chris was thrilled by the opportunity and shared the news with Mrs. Garcia, who was equally excited. "Oh, Chris, this is just the beginning for you. Tommy would be so proud." Chris joined the program with enthusiasm, bringing new ideas and insights from his experiences with Mrs. Garcia. He became a mentor to younger kids in the neighborhood, encouraging them to help out their own families and neighbors, just as he had done. Under his guidance, the youth program took on new projects, cleaning up local parks, organizing charity drives, and even helping elderly neighbors with household tasks. Chris's impact on the community continued to grow, spreading the same warmth and unity that he'd shared with Mrs. Garcia. The legacy of kindness. As summer rolled in, The oak tree Chris and Mrs. Garcia had planted stood taller, its leaves lush and green. It had become a fixture in the community, a gathering place where neighbors came to chat, relax, and enjoy the simple beauty of life. Birds nested in its branches, kids played around its trunk, and a small plaque beneath it read, "In memory of Tommy Garcia," and the power of friendship. Mrs. Garcia's health continued to improve, and her heart was full of joy as she saw the impact Chris had made. Her home had become a place of gathering, filled with laughter, stories, and the friendships she had once thought lost. One sunny afternoon, as Chris and Mrs. Garcia sat beneath the oak, she placed a gentle hand on his. "You've given me so much, Chris. You've not only honored Tommy's memory, but created something even more beautiful." Chris smiled, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. "It's all because of you, Mrs. Garcia. You've taught me so much about kindness, resilience, and love." They sat in peaceful silence, watching the breeze rustle through the oak leaves, each lost in thought. Chris knew that his journey had only just begun, that the lessons he learned here would stay with him forever. And as he looked around at the thriving community around them, he realized that the love he'd found with Mrs. Garcia was a gift that would keep growing, just like the oak they had planted. A legacy takes root. As summer deepened, the oak tree in Mrs. Garcia's yard stood as a thriving testament to the love and unity that had blossomed in the neighborhood. Chris found himself spending countless hours beneath its shade, reflecting on the journey that had brought him closer not only to Mrs. Garcia, but to everyone around him. One afternoon, while he and Mrs. Garcia were sitting together by the tree, she reached into her sweater pocket and pulled out a small, polished stone. She handed it to Chris with a tender smile. "This was Tommy's," she said, her voice soft with nostalgia. "He found it on one of our family trips and kept it as a reminder that even small things have their own beauty and value. I'd like you to have it, Chris, as a reminder of him and of us." Chris accepted the stone, feeling the weight of her words settle into his heart. "Thank you, Mrs. Garcia," he murmured, touched by the gesture. "I'll carry it with me always." Mrs. Garcia patted his hand gently. "Just remember, Chris, the good you put into the world has a way of coming back to you. I'm so proud of you for everything you've done. For me, for the neighborhood, and for yourself." Over the next few weeks, Chris began to plan one final event, a neighborhood celebration under the oak tree. He wanted to honor Mrs. Garcia and the impact she'd had on his life, along with the countless lives she had touched. With his parents' help and the support of his friends from the youth program, Chris organized a legacy gathering, inviting everyone to celebrate the bond they shared. The legacy gathering. On the day of the gathering, the backyard transformed into a festive haven. Strings of lights were woven through the branches of the oak, casting a soft, golden glow across the yard. Tables were set with flowers and photos of shared memories, each one celebrating the friendships and connections that had grown over the past year. Neighbors arrived with potluck dishes, smiles, and open hearts. Chris greeted each guest with warmth, watching as people mingled, laughed, and shared stories. The event was as much a tribute to Mrs. Garcia as it was to the community itself, a celebration of the strength they'd found together. As the sun began to set, Chris took a deep breath, gathering his courage to speak in front of everyone. He climbed onto a small wooden bench beneath the oak, his voice carrying over the gentle hum of the gathering. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "When I first met Mrs. Garcia, I never imagined how much she would change my life. She taught me that kindness has a ripple effect, that small acts can bring people together in ways we don't always see." He paused, his eyes meeting Mrs. Garcia's. "This oak tree we planted together, it's more than just a tree. It's a symbol of the love, resilience, and unity we've all built here. And it's a reminder that, no matter what, we're all connected." The crowd erupted in applause, and Mrs. Garcia wiped a tear from her cheek, her face alight with pride and joy. Chris stepped down, embracing her as she whispered, You've made me the happiest I've been in years, Chris. Thank you. A life-changing opportunity. Not long after the gathering, Chris received an unexpected email from the director of the youth leadership program. The email congratulated him on his community work and invited him to apply for a scholarship to a prestigious leadership camp. The camp would bring together young people from across the state to learn about community building, mentorship, and social change. Chris's heart raced as he read the invitation. The camp was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and he knew Mrs. Garcia would be thrilled. After discussing it with his parents, he decided to apply, pouring his passion for community work and the lessons he learned into his application essay. 2 weeks later, he received the news. He'd been accepted with a full scholarship. Chris couldn't contain his excitement as he rushed over to Mrs. Garcia's house to tell her the news. "Oh, Chris," she exclaimed, beaming with pride. "I always knew you were destined for something great. You have a gift for bringing people together, just like Tommy did." Chris grinned, feeling a wave of gratitude. "Thank you, Mrs. Garcia. I wouldn't be here without you. You've taught me more than anyone else." They sat together for hours that afternoon, sharing stories and dreams for the future. Mrs. Garcia encouraged him to pursue his passions, reminding him to stay grounded in kindness and compassion. "Remember," she said, "no matter where life takes you, the most important thing is to remain true to yourself. You have the power to change lives. Chris, never forget that." Leaving for camp. The day of his departure arrived sooner than he expected. Chris packed his bags with a mixture of excitement and sadness, knowing he'd miss Mrs. Garcia and the neighborhood he had come to love. Before leaving, he visited her one last time. Mrs. Garcia was waiting for him on her porch, her face glowing with pride. She handed him a small envelope. "Don't open this until you're at camp," she instructed with a wink. "It's a little something to remind you of home." Chris hugged her tightly, feeling a lump form in his throat. "I'll miss you, Mrs. Garcia. I'll write to you every week. And I'll be right here, cheering you on," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. "Go out there and show the world what kindness can do." With a final wave, Chris left, carrying her wisdom, her kindness, and the weight of her love with him. Returning home, a new beginning. When camp ended, Chris returned home with a renewed sense of purpose. He had learned so much, not just about leadership, but about the importance of compassion, empathy, and connection, values Mrs. Garcia had instilled in him from the beginning. On his first day back, he visited her, eager to share everything he had experienced. But as he arrived at her home, he was greeted by Mrs. Singh, who approached him with a gentle, understanding expression. "Chris," she said softly, her eyes misty, "Mrs. Garcia passed away peacefully a few days ago. She was so proud of you, and she wanted you to know that she loved you dearly." Chris felt his heart ache, a deep, hollow sadness filling him. But he remembered her words, her wisdom, and the strength she had given him. Through his tears, he thanked Mrs. Singh, feeling a bittersweet peace settle within him. In the days that followed, Chris helped organize a small memorial under the oak tree, inviting the neighborhood to gather one last time in Mrs. Garcia's memory. They shared stories, laughter, and tears, honoring the woman who had brought so much love and unity to their lives. The tree stood tall and resilient, its branches casting shade over the gathering, a living tribute to Mrs. Garcia's life and the legacy she had left behind. A lasting legacy. Years later, Chris found himself back in the neighborhood, now as a young adult pursuing a career in community service. The oak tree, fully grown and strong, greeted him as he walked up to Mrs. Garcia's former home. A small plaque still sat at its base, reading, "In memory of Tommy Garcia and the power of friendship." Chris placed a hand on the tree, feeling the strength of its roots, the life that had grown from the simple act of planting it together. He closed his eyes, remembering Mrs. Garcia's laugh, her kindness, and the wisdom she had shared with him. With a deep breath, he whispered, "Thank you, Mrs. Garcia. I'll carry you with me always." As he walked away, Chris felt her presence beside him, guiding him forward. The oak tree stood tall behind him, a lasting symbol of love, resilience, and the power of friendship, a legacy that would live on through every life Chris touched.